Hello, guys. Thank you for joining us again on this Facts First podcast. So, for today, we have a very special guest. We're going to talk about the real challenges that Filipino voters are expected to face in the coming 2022 elections. We're fortunate to have with us today one of the most engaging and, of course, passionate lawmakers, especially when he was still with the House of Representatives. And right now, he's a professor of sociology, adjunct professor of sociology at the State University at New York at Binghamton. He's also the founder of Focus on the Global South, and of course, is also the national chairman of Laban ng Masa, a coalition of different non-governmental organizations. And most of you perhaps know him also as a former representative of the Akbayan Party List group. Thank you very much for joining us on this podcast, Professor Walden Bello. Thank you, sir.
Thank you for inviting me, Christian.
Okay. Actually, sir, I've been wanting to invite you on this podcast for for more than a year now because I wanted to get your thoughts regarding the different political issues here in the Philippines. And for this episode, I decided to somehow focus the discussion on the 2022 elections. People might be thinking, well, it's still too early. Still more than a year before the elections next year. But I thought personally, I don't know if you're going to agree with me, that now is the perfect time to really thresh out the issues. So for today, we're going to talk about the real challenges. So basically, the real enemy in 2022 that we have to slay. What do you think of that, sir?
Yes, I definitely think it's extremely important to realize as we move towards 2022 that it will be a very decisive election. And it will mean either we go further into an authoritarian regime headed by possibly the daughter of the president, or people really confront the fact that the change that we need is something much more substantial than what has occurred over the last several years, over the last several decades. So it will be a time of reckoning for the Philippines to really face up to what the country needs to do in order to advance as a nation, as a people.
Okay. Of course, at this point, those who are opposed to President Rodrigo Duterte are actually entertaining the basic logic that the candidate who should win in next year's presidential election should be anybody but the candidate of President Rodrigo Duterte. But I don't know whether you agree with that somehow simplistic characterization of the upcoming elections. What do you think of that?
Well, yes, I have problems with that. I understand that that there is a great deal of frustration around the policies of the administration, but I think that the candidates should be able to put forward their platforms, meet the public, and tell them why they're running for office. To just simply say that I am the anti-Duterte, I don't think that's something that will buy the allegiance of the Filipino people at this point in time. I think you've really got to give them something substantial, like why should I vote for you? In terms of tell me what you represent. Instead of just coming up and saying, I'm the anti-Duterte and, you need to vote for me, warts and all. So I don't think that is, the way to go. In fact, we in Laban ng Masa have said, that rather than have the candidate, against the administration come at the beginning of the process and something that is negotiated between different groups. It should really come at the end of the process after a process whereby different candidates have presented their platforms to the public, and the public has been able to study what they stand for. So that would be the process that I would be supporting,
Okay.
rather than something that sort of basically says from the very beginning, we'll just have to support the person who can beat Duterte. I think that's not a very good way to start the run up to 2022.
And to be honest, baka that particular perspective might be doomed from the very start if you consider the other factors involved in a campaign, no? But this early, ano tingin niyo, Professor Bello, what are the issues that should define the campaign in 2022?
Well, one is definitely the respect for human rights. We have gone through a fairly bloody 4 years. The 20,000 lives taken in extrajudicial executions. The role of due process. This is very basic to our democracy, that we cannot just let lives be snuffed out. And I think that this should be raised very, very strongly, that this is one of the mortal sins of this government. Secondly, I think that the question of real reform of the economy in particular is extremely critical. We're in a situation whereby the statistics may differ, but I think that the poverty rate is still someplace between 25 and 28%. And that's horrible, that we have such a percentage of people. And I believe that it's the worst record in Southeast Asia. No? So, basically, the candidate should be examined. What are you going to do about this? You cannot just say that, I'm going to create jobs. You've got to tell people how you're going to create jobs, And also extremely important here is, what sort of economic direction will the country take? Will we follow the same, what people call the neoliberal policy that has been followed over the last 20 years and which has not resulted in any real gains for people, except to just send our people abroad, because there are no jobs here. So I think the question of the economic program that will really end poverty is important. Third, of course, is the question of equality. If you go by the Gini coefficient, which is the best measure of inequality, the Philippines is one of the worst in Southeast Asia. So we have a situation where we have, something of the order of 1 to 2%, which is very, very, very rich. Okay, and 90% of the people are, maybe have access to only about 20% of the wealth of the country. So this is a very unequal society, and that really has to be changed, and that's really tied up with the question of what economic program to follow. And then we have, of course, the issue of the environment. This president has, been one of the worst in terms of environmental policies. He was supposed to be anti-mining, but he ended up being, the friends of the miners, this and the so-called anti-mining policy that he articulated during his campaign, really went down the drain. So we have, a fairly fragile environment at this point. Mining has dislocated communities. The question of climate crisis has not been addressed. So these are things that have to be seriously offered, by tackled by candidates.
By the candidates.
Then, of course, there is the question, and let me just post this too. We do need a foreign policy that is not either a pro-American one, which was represented by the Aquino administration and Albert Del Rosario, nor a pro-China one, which is that of President Duterte. And just this evening, we saw how awful the president's policy has been, denying that he even wanted to defend the West Philippine Sea, and the foreign secretary apologizing for cursing China. This is a foreign policy that's a big joke, so no wonder Filipinos are really, really, really upset at the way this government has traded our sovereignty. Of course, let me just put it this way, Christian, there's no realistic way that we can face up to the might of China, okay? But Christ, we should at least save our dignity and say, this is our territory, and we're going to challenge China legally, diplomatically, each step of the way.
Yeah.
And, so this administration has been a big foreign policy failure, when it comes to this. So let me just end there for the time being.
Okay. But do you think the Filipino voters, the Filipino electorate, have enough patience, not to forget, but instead to sustain this kind of commitment to these issues, to be able to actually hold those who are running in 2022 to account? I'm talking about the incumbent officials under this administration, and to actually scrutinize all candidates on where they stand on these issues that you just laid down.
Yes, I definitely. I mean, the way that the Filipino electorate has been over the last few years, unfortunately, you're right. That the ability to be able to look at the issues and get easily swayed by all sorts of promises and the image and image politics and the way, for instance, that Duterte was able to project the strongman image, without having any program at all, except one, which was to kill people, criminals. That is the big challenge that we have. So the big challenge which you put it, Christian, is the big challenge to us is finally to say, hindi na maaari itong mga politikang ganito. No? Mm-hmm. This politics which has doomed the country, a very personalist politics, easily swayed by money, easily swayed by superficial images. Our people have to come to the conclusion now that it's time to change. It's time that we really look at the hard issues. And I think that that we may not succeed in 2022 in a big overhaul of our attitudes towards elections, but at least we can begin. And my sense is, that there are young people, the new generations, who are really tired of the politics of their elders, who would be responsive to an issue-based politics that you connect with non-corrupt people, and people who are open, who would stand up for their rights. So I think that a combination of people who stand on principle, stand for their rights, okay, and substantive issues. I think that there is an audience for that now, and I think we need to expand that audience. As I said, we may not succeed in 2022, but this is the time to begin that process.
But do you think this young voters, assuming that most of them, a significant number of them, actually register for 2022 and actually cast their vote, that this group can create enough ripples to influence positively others who have been somehow inured with the way we do politics or have been doing politics over the past several generations. You mentioned personalistic politics. But again, of course, it's good that people like you are seeing the situation still in a positive note. But a lot of people are quite pessimistic about the prospects of changing from within, given the kind of system that we have now, right? Even if we are dealing with a pandemic right now, for instance, the moment that you, for example, start getting vaccinated, people, a good number of them might tend to forget about the failures of their leaders during the start of the pandemic.
Yes, this kind of short-term memory is, something that it's not just something that is a problem with the Filipino electorate. Okay, I think you have electorates all over the world, that are susceptible to sort of personalist politics and to short-term memory and to being swayed by political promises. So that's a given. That will always be a very great temptation to fall into. However, I do think, that there is at this point enough dissatisfaction with people, especially the younger generations, that if they can just be told, or presented with the fact that, hey, there is another possible path, but we have to be partners in this process. We have to really be partners in terms of forging this. Okay, I think that as I said, it may not fully succeed in 2022, but if we begin that process, I think as you find more and more committed people, you find more and more attractive ways to bring your ideas together, that you can, in fact, create eventually a bandwagon effect, that will go beyond the elections. And, this has happened in, so many other democracies, where populist politics, people turn their back on populist politics and begin to really appreciate the fact that a politics of issues was being offered that was not immediately attractive, but certainly offered ideas on where to go and how to go. And I think, Christian, to come back to your question, the biggest challenge or the biggest enemy, as you might put it, for 2022 is the old politics. Okay, will our compatriots again fall for that kind of politics, or will there be enough of them to say, no, we're going to push ahead on something else? And maybe we really need political forces at this point, that offer this other way to people. So that's my sense.
Yeah, a new way of doing politics. Let's go back to the events that led to President Duterte's election in 2016. I'd like to, of course, people remember what you did in 2015 when you did the unimaginable. You were a member of the House of the Representatives. You resigned your post because of your dissatisfaction of the Aquino administration at that time. Your group Akbayan was very much aligned with the Aquino administration at that time. Of course, a lot of academics have uh, expressed their analyses as to how President Duterte was able to assume office, taking advantage of that immense frustration by a good number of Filipinos with the old way of doing things in Philippine politics. So they decided to try someone like Duterte. Baka hindi natin subukan. Sabi niya, pagpapatay niya lahat ng adik, siguro talagang baka gagawin niya. At sabi niya, he could end the drug problem in 3 to 6 months. At sabi niya, he would ride a jet ski going to Scarborough Shoal and plant the Philippine flag. We knew at that time, hindi naman siguro tangay mga butante, no? People knew that this was, a good part of those statements were unrealistic. But somehow that presented a breath of fresh air uh, in the current political climate at that time, no? My question, Professor Bello, is given what happened since 2016 until now, with the way the president has been handling or governing the country, the failures, the successes, the mishandling of the pandemic, for instance, do you think this kind of leadership, this kind of political leadership, is actually here to stay, or that it could be considered as an aberration, and that somehow we could correct ourselves again in 2022?
Yes. Okay. The first thing that I'd like to say is we have a chance to correct or to change course in 2022. But having said that, let me just say, that I think that if you remember, we had in 2001 what was called EDSA 3. Okay. And this was people coming out in the streets because they thought, that basically the rich elites in the Philippines were violating the rights of Arab, who was seen as sort of, the
Kumbaga,
people of the masses.
the rich, they took advantage of that situation,
Right.
to remove a democratically elected president,
Yes, yes.
supported by
And
the masses.
whatever his character was, appeared to them to offer some sort of future that was not being offered by, the elites in the Philippines. So it, I think you can just imagine, Christian, that was a time when class conflict was in the air. Okay,
Yeah.
For the first time in so many years of the republic, it was class conflict in the air. Okay, now what happened was, of course, EDSA 3 failed, and I think that there continued to be this tremendous dissatisfaction. It was just not being catalyzed. And then Duterte came along. And I think what happened is that all those frustrations of ordinary people about not have, of the politics and the economy getting nowhere, combined with the frustrations of many people in the middle class that the EDSA Republic had not delivered, okay? Yeah. That sort of created the situation that made people attracted to Duterte. I agree with Senator De Lima that Duterte essentially ran as a one-issue candidate, which is, he was going to get the criminals. But I think this is a very short view of politics if we say that it was really on account of that he won. I think what people did was they read what they wanted into Duterte. The fact that he was seen to be this strong person. A lot of people basically said, oh my God, maybe he can also deal with the corrupt people. He can also shape up these elites that getting away with not paying taxes, So basically, I think this image of the strong hand was seen as something that he wouldn't just apply against criminals, but he would also discipline the elites on this. And I think this is a great part of the reason why, say, our overseas Filipino community went very strongly for Duterte because they had basically, these are the people who had their status in life was so different from their education, so there was a lot of resentments there, and I think that Duterte was able to catalyze those resentments. Okay?
But do you think
So,
Duterte has done enough since 2016 to actually convince the voters in 2022 that they would want and need more of the same and not change course?
well, this is a really good question because if you remember, in around November of last year, he still had a 90% approval rating. Okay. And it was Pulse Asia, but I think methodology of Pulse Asia is correct. And the thing is that in terms of the record, there was nothing that the government could boast of, including and especially the continuing debacle over COVID-19. But the problem here is, Christian, that and this is what I call the politics of charisma. Duterte has a certain charisma. Okay, he may not be the sort of inspirational sort like Modi, but he cuts across class lines. And that charisma is something that is still quite strong. Okay, whether we like it or not. And I think there are several things operating here. There is a sort of a charismatic appeal. Yes. There is the fact that people feel that they voted for Duterte and they cannot face up to the fact that they made a mistake. And Senator De Lima, in my interview of her, says this, that people don't want to admit that they made a mistake, so they would much rather continue to support the guy. And then the third thing here that is also operative is that, people may say, okay, I don't agree with everything this guy has done, but there are certain things that I agree with. Okay. So this is the psychology of the voter that basically says, I don't agree with the fact that he's killed people without due process, but hey, maybe he can reform the system, the economic system, So, and I think leading up to 2016, there were many people, including former members of the progressive movement, who were willing to swallow the extrajudicial executions because they thought that Duterte would in fact be able to, was positive in terms of being a progressive. Yeah. We don't need to mention names at this point in time.
I'm tempted to mention names actually, but I know where you're coming from. I know exactly what you mean. And that was quite frustrating early on.
Right. So this is the kind of complex political psychology that we're dealing with. So if you then ask me, Christian, what is the next poll going to show? Okay, if it shows that the guy, despite all his failures, okay, all his cursing, all his misogynistic statement, still has about an 80% approval rating, I would say I would not be surprised because we're dealing, let's face it, we're dealing with what I call the politics of the non-rational, the politics of charisma. Okay. And our big mistake, I think, of many analysts is to see people as voting according to rational calculus alone. Okay. That, people vote their interests. In fact, what we've seen in so many countries around the world in the last few years, including the United States, is that people vote their fears, their frustrations, okay, and they're being sucked into the charisma of a leader. So that's why I think we really need to understand where people are coming out at this point. That this is a kind of politics that I think is very dangerous, because a guy may screw up, like Duterte has done, and yet he's still able to come out with a high approval rating. So we just need to face up to the fact that these are the complex politics that we're now dealing with at this point.
And it can be very, very frustrating. But don't you think the mishandling of his administration of the Philippines' pandemic response can actually serve as an eye opener, a wake up call once and for all, for people to realize that they made a mistake, that this was not the kind of leader that they need, that we need at this time during the pandemic?
That is our hope. In fact, that is our hope, that we can, in fact, tell people that, hey, you were wrong, or many of you were wrong in giving this guy high approval ratings, because he has led the Philippines down a wrong path. Okay, and I think that is the case that we need to make. Okay, but all I'm trying to say is that if we go by reason alone, okay, and say that, hey, palpak, 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 and therefore papalpak sa elections yung successor, I don't think that necessarily follows, okay? Because as I said, we really need to realize now that we are dealing with the politics of non-rationality, the politics of charisma. So I think we need to make our case to the people and begin to tell them, and begin to draw them out and engage with them that, hey, we really need a new direction. Okay. Now, I'm not saying that it has to be all program, right? All has to be ideas, because if it's just all ideas, that's not going to succeed. You really need to inspire people. You have to have people who can be inspirational because of their principles and what they stand for, and also their ideas. Now, that's a politics that we really need at this point. And I think that's the kind of politics that we need, that respects people, that tells them, hey, we're not just going to come to you and say that I am the anti-Duterte and therefore vote for me, but I have a package, I have a record, and I'd like to engage you on it. No? So a politics of engagement rather than just assuming that you can win over people by saying you're the anti-Duterte.
How about the politics of decency? I mean, the projection of decency. They think this could still work in the face of this so-called politics of charisma or politics of non-rationality, because this was tried before, especially in 2019. And unfortunately for the opposition, they were wiped out. It didn't work.
Yes, I never really thought that the politics of decency was going to be an answer to Duterte. I think the problem, much as I know that there were good individuals that were running in 2019, okay. Nevertheless, you see, let me put it this way. They were too tarnished by the yellow regime, you call it this. What I'm trying to say is, and this is, let's get back to what you said, about my resignation. The thing that about the Aquino administration was there was double standards, on the one hand, the anti-corruption thing was being used against enemies of the government, but at the same time, friends of the government were being allowed to get away with so many things like the disbursement acceleration program, which was a big boondoggle. Now, I guess my point here is, that one, from my point of view, is that if you're really serious about reform, you can't have double standards. And this is why I broke with Akbayan and I broke with the administration, because I said this is not what we were running for in 2010. And then the second thing is, people cannot stand hypocrisy. Okay. So if you are, saying something that you stand for, but what you're doing is something else, I think people are going to be very disillusioned with that. And basically, I think this is the whole problem with the EDSA Republic, which began in 2000 and in 1986. That it presented itself as, the Republic of Justice, the Republic of Light, the Republic of Democracy, and yet actually political practice, was the Republic of Corruption. It was the old way of doing things. It was the elites ruling. So my sense is that this politics of hypocrisy is what really discredited, the governments before Duterte, no, and especially the last, government administration of Aquino. So I think what this really shows is people will not stand for hypocrisy. They can see through you, okay, and you can't just fool them and practice double standards. And this is why I think that the elite politics of the liberal democratic system in the Philippines, which was very hypocritical, paved the way for the triumph of Duterte in 2016.
Okay. Now, speaking of hypocrisy,
popularity, yes.
Kasi any administration naman, they have their own hypocrisies, definitely. So even the all post-EDSA administrations, and even administrations that came before, had their own hypocrisies. But why do you think Duterte is getting away with the kind of hypocrisy or hypocrisies that his administration has been exhibiting since 2016? And how come somehow the people, when they looked at the hypocrisies of, let's say, the Aquino administration, they were more unforgiving, which somehow helped bring to power someone like Duterte?
Well, I think if I may be, if I may be, one of several things I think are happening here. One is, for some reason, Duterte basically is seen as, he double talks, okay, and he is not afraid of the fact that he double talks, and that there's this sort of I am what you am, I am what you see, okay, and I'm misogynistic, I'm this, and I'm not going to cover it up for some reason. And I guess here is political psychology again. There is an appeal to certain sectors of the population of that kind of brazen and almost brutal frankness, and not trying to say, I'm really a nice and decent guy, okay? So there's that element there. The second thing, I guess, is he has been able to project a father image, let's face it, okay? A stern father image, okay, and I think that there are sectors of the population to whom that was very important, okay, a patriarchal sort of image, okay, and then the third thing is, again, people reading into him what they wanted rather than what he really was. Okay. And then the fourth factor is the kind of charisma that the guy has. So you have to bring this all together to understand why, despite the palpak over 5 years, he retains a certain degree of popularity that may even go up to around 70 to 80% at this point. It's a big challenge, Christian. Now, I guess what would where I am different, I guess, from many of my friends, is that for many of them, they basically just dismiss the guy. Okay, that he's basically a cross between a bum and a clown. Okay, but for me, I think I have a healthy respect for the guy. I mean, not respect for him in respect, but I have a healthy respect for his political staying power. And maybe that's because I'm a sociologist and I can understand the politics of non-rationality, the politics of charisma, the politics that goes beyond ideas. Okay. And so I'm not underestimating the guy. And I'm not underestimating the fact that despite a really bad record, his successor could still make it. So this is the challenge before us, that we really have our work cut out for us to show that, he is not really, what you wanted him to be. Okay.
Speaking of challenges, we're now at the tail end of our discussion, Professor Bello. What do you think of this Isang Bayan initiative? Basically, a coalition that hopes to bring together all opposition forces and come up with a single candidate that would go up against whoever candidate President Duterte would choose in 2022. In the first place, were you invited to be part of this coalition?
No, we were not invited to be part of the coalition. And I think there were I suspect certain reasons for that, but we need not go into that at this point. But what do I think about it? First of all, I think that it's positive. Okay. Secondly, I think that it would be great if there were a unified one candidate in the 2022 elections from the opposition. Where I differ from Isang Bayan is that I feel that the choice of a candidate should come at the end of a process whereby different people or different candidates from the opposition are given the chance to connect with the electorate and present themselves, rather than this being a process whereby a few people or a few parties behind the scenes sort of negotiate who to place here, and here. That's not a democratic process. Okay, I think that one of the things I admire about the U.S. process is how the primaries set up the different candidates of a party against each other and see who is able to connect with the people. Okay, that's why I'm saying that let's have that kind of process here, rather than have a kind of, leaders choose who to put there rather than who the people really feel should be the candidate against Duterte. So that's my biggest problem with the Isang Bayan initiative, that it's really not the best way to go around building a unified opposition, because it leaves the choice up to organization elites, to haggle over who gets placed here, who gets placed there, who is the candidate, rather than a process whereby it becomes a process of elimination, because you are exposed to the people. And if you can connect with them, you should be the candidate. If you can't connect, then yield to somebody else.
Well, Professor Walden Bello, thank you very much for joining us on this podcast. Always a pleasure to talk with you, Professor Bello.
Thank you, Christian. And I'm very happy to have been part of this podcast. And I congratulate you on your coming marriage, is it? And
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
which we've been seeing a lot in the internet.
Okay. Maraming salamat, Professor Walden Bello. And that's
Maraming
it for,
salamat.
and that's it for this week's episode of our Facts First podcast. Again, this podcast is available on YouTube, on Spotify, Apple, Google, and Stitcher. Thank you very much for joining us.